Hi everyone, welcome to lesson 2. So in today's lesson we are going to quickly scaffold basic loopback for application. So for this we'll follow the official documentation under the getting started section. We need to have Node.js version 10 or higher installed. If you don't have it, head on to nodejs.org and download the installer. If you are on Windows, Mac and so on, you can pick the correct version. It's very straightforward. So I do have a Node installed, so I will skip this step. Now the next step is to actually install Loopback for CLI. So Loopback CLI is just a command line interface that allows us to scaffold basic project structure. It will ask you a couple of questions. So let's do that. So I do have installed the CLI, but I will just update it just for the demo purposes. So open your command line, npm install global loopback CLI. So this will pull the most recent version and install it globally. This may take a minute. So let's maybe create a new folder for our project. So mkdirl test project. Let's cd into it. There's nothing inside. That's grand. Now let's open this. Okay, so it looks like my version got updated into the 2.8 version. So we can start. So in our test project folder, you can run lb4 app. This is a command that will scaffold your application. The first question we got is a project name. If you hit enter, it will keep this default name. So let's do that. Project description, coding examples, lesson 2. Project root directory, let's leave it empty. Let's leave it by default. Application class name, default. Now, it asks you to select features that you would like to have enabled in your project. And this is kind of cool. Enable ESLint. So really what linter is, if you work on a project and there's multiple people that work on the same project, and each of them have different configuration for linter. Some may use double quotes, someone can use single quotes, someone can break lines, and so on. And then you make a pull request, and you have to review this pull request, and it's very hard to see the actual code differences because of the formatting. Everyone have a different formatting. So prettier and linter allows you to kind of set common rules, common ground for your project, which is kind of cool. It comes out of the box in Loopback. Now, Mocha is a test running environment. So in ordinary Express project, you'd have to install your test dependencies separate, like, sign on, expect, some kind of assertion libraries. You could have a couple of them. In Loopback, it comes out of the box in a package they call, I believe, test lab. So if you enable this, it will as well pull all those testing dependencies like sign on, super test agents and stuff like that. So it's all of the box as one dependency. You don't have to have install them separate. Now we have some VS Code, config files, Docker support. You can include Dockerfile and Docker ignore, and so on. So I'm going to leave all of those options on. So you can see it's scaffolding our application. So like I mentioned, tsconfig, it's just our TypeScript compiler configuration file. You can set some kind of options here. Package.json, pretty much same structure as in any NPM project. We have some kind of scripts. Loopback comes with some predefined scripts for prettier, for linter, and so on. Dependencies, you can see at the minute we have only loopback related dependencies. We do have some dev dependencies, and if you look at here, we have this test lab package. This is the package that contains all the testing framework related libraries. So instead of having 4 or 5 different ones, we only have one, which is kind of cool as well. We have our Docker files, we have our prettier configuration, ESLinter configuration. Out of the box, we get a git ignore file with some sample settings. We have Docker ignore file as well. We have our public folder. So this public index HTML at the very start is what basically renders your Swagger UI. So when you go into, for example, localhost 3000, it will display this index page. And within this page, you will have by default two links. First one pointing to your OpenAPI specification at this path. And the second one would be API Explorer, which is the Swagger kind of UI. Node modules folder, VS Code, settings files. And here's the main project file, src source file. So they break it down into sections, kind of a model view controller. We have tests, we have controllers, we have data sources, models, and repos. So just to give you a quick overview, inside our controllers, out of the box, we get the ping controller. And ping controller is a class with one get method pointing to the ping path. And if you scroll over get, you will see at the top that it says that the second element is an operation object. So this response 200 ping response is OpenAPI specification response. So if the user invokes this endpoint and gets 200 response, he will receive representation of ping response. And ping response itself is declared just at the top here using OpenAPI specification. So you can see it has description, content, schema, and properties. And properties are greeting, date, URL, and headers. Now, if you look on the actual return statement, you can see that the greeting, date, URL, headers maps to what we define in our OpenAPI specification. So in this case, it's just pinging back some stuff that comes from the request. And if you wonder how do they got this actual request in here, is through the dependency injection. So in the constructor of this controller, they injected the request object and created like a local version of it. So you have access to it. So anything that comes into request, you can access it through this, that request, headers, URLs, and so on. Now, data source is the folder responsible for your data source. That could be databases, that could be external REST services using REST connector, or SOAP services using SOAP connector. Models, this is the folder which will hold your models. For example, if your application would allow users to register on your site, you could have user model that will have some kind of first names, second name, and stuff like that. Repo is basically kind of abstraction layer between your models and data sources. So in Loopback applications, you don't have to directly operate on your data sources, but you can operate on, for the CRUD operations, you can operate on repositories, which will bind your models, for example, users, to your data source to, for example, hold the users. So then you can perform your CRUD operations on repo instead of directly calling databases. Now, application.ts is the main starting point of your application. In terms of important concept in Loopback is line 22, this sequence, my sequence. So the way Loopback handles the request response cycle is within the sequence.ts file in here. So this is kind of file that each individual request and response travel through. You have a possibility of changing and extending the sequence file. You can create your own. You could add a sequence action that will, for example, authenticate each incoming request or some kind of authorization. Or you could invoke, this is very new, I think they've added this last month, invoke middleware. You could declare a list of middleware here and append it after comma in here as a middleware list, and each request will travel through your middleware list. This is kind of Express related stuff. So yeah, this is a high-level overview of the project structure. On the next lesson, we will scaffold a simple application using user model, and we'll create a new controller and repository that allows us to perform some kind of CRUD operations on our model. Thank you. And of course, please like and subscribe.